Welcome to the Gateway Radio Program, a weekly radio series discussing the issues of human potential and technologies. The Gateway Radio Program is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a research and educational organization dedicated to the exploration of conscious awareness. Here now is your host of the Gateway Radio Program, Mark Serta.
My guest today is author Colin Wilson. He's one of the most prolific writers of our century. Colin has authored over 100 books, mostly dealing in unexplained phenomena and the human psyche. Colin, thanks for being with us.
Pleasure.
Pleasure's mine. You've written on so many topics dealing with what might be loosely described as metaphysics. How do you like to describe the body of your work?
I started off with a book called The Outsider, which came out in 1956. And I suppose you would say that that was about social misfits. But what basically interested me was the enormous suicide rate among men of genius in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. People like Van Gogh and Nijinsky, the dancer, and who went insane, Schumann, the composer who went insane. It struck me that they themselves felt that the world was the kind of place they didn't want to live in, because they experienced curious states of intense ecstasy, mm-hmm. which left them with a feeling that they could live on a far higher level. Mm-hmm. And then these states always, of course, tend to evaporate, so you wake up the next morning thinking, what the hell was all that about?
Right.
And suspecting that the whole thing was an illusion. That's what interested me so much. Now, this kind of thing didn't really begin before the end of the 18th century. People just suddenly started having these curious states. For example, people didn't really notice that nature was beautiful in the 18th century. The people who pointed that out were poets like Wordsworth, who suddenly, for the first time, saw hills and mountains and so on as beautiful. If you'd said that to Jonathan Swift 50 years earlier, he would have gaped at you and said, "What do you mean?" So suddenly people began to experience these curious states of intensity, but they strongly suspected that it was all illusion, or that the world, with its materialism, is such that it's bound to destroy the kind of people who are carried away and feel that this is the only worthwhile thing in life. That, I think, is why so many people of the 19th century, so many men of genius, felt that the world is an impossible place that they didn't really want to live in. Ivan Karamazov, in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, says, "It's not God I reject, I just want to give him back his entrance ticket." And a great many of those romantics of the 19th century really felt that way, that there was a split between the world and the spirit, mm-hmm. and that if you belong to the realm of the spirit, then unfortunately you had, in a sense, chosen death. Mm-hmm. You condemned yourself to death. Now, that is what fascinated me, because in my teens, I had these sort of tremendously open, ecstatic, happy states, which I'd had ever since I was a child. Mm-hmm. Particularly at Christmas time, kids get this wonderful feeling that everything is suddenly perfect.
Well, the people that you're describing, I'm assuming, are members of the industrial Western society. Surely others in Eastern agrarian societies have the magic and the mystery of life ingrained in their cultures and religion. Do you think technology and the Industrial Revolution have left Westerners wanting in spiritual insight and experience?
Don't forget, although it's perfectly true that other cultures have had a tradition of spirituality, to some extent the Industrial Revolution created this spirituality in Western religion, just because when suddenly it's taken away from you and you're stuck in the middle of a city, this is the time when you really begin to appreciate nature and hills.
Yeah, I see your point. When was it that you decided to begin writing about these observations?
When I went into the RAF briefly as to do my national service. I came out of the RAF and got married because the girl got pregnant. I worked at labouring jobs. I determined that I hated offices so much that I would prefer to dig ditches, and I did for quite a while. I slept out in the open in London on Hampstead Heath in a waterproof sleeping bag to save money, because I didn't want to have to earn money to pay rent. At the same time, I went down to the British Museum every day and worked in the reading room there, writing my first novel. This was when I was about 20 or 21. I was working away there in the reading room when the superintendent, who was a novelist called Angus Wilson, said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm writing a novel." And Angus Wilson, who was homosexual, I think, and, maybe attracted by me, but whatever the reason was, he was incredibly kind and said, "I'll read it for you if you like, and if it's good, recommend it to my publisher." The result was that in Christmas 1954, there was I in my room in New Cross in South London. I'd had to move indoors again because it rained so heavily that winter. There was I sitting there with nothing to do. Joy, my girlfriend, and now my wife, had gone home for Christmas, and having nothing to write, I started to sketch out a book that I called The Outsider in Literature, and which was basically about these social misfits and outsiders. And as soon as the New Year came, as soon as the British Museum opened again 2 days later, I rushed along there, and on the way to the museum, I suddenly remembered a novel that I'd read about when I was about 14 years old. It was by a French novelist called Henri Barbusse, and it was called Hell, and it was about a man who lives alone in a room in a boarding house when he discovers at the top of the wall a tiny hole, and when he looks through this hole he can see into the next room, and he just spends his days staring through the hole at the people who come and go in the next room, the various people who take the room.
Almost as an observer to another world.
Absolutely, completely outside, in other words.
Right.
And that seemed to me the symbol of the outsider. And so as soon as I got to the museum, I found this book in the catalogue, ordered it, read it right through in about 4 hours, and then copied down a paragraph from the book, and that was the beginning of The Outsider. And I was very lucky. I started writing The Outsider about all of these characters who feel themselves alienated from modern life. And I sent off a chunk of it to a publisher, the first chapter, and he accepted it more or less on the strength of the first chapter before the book was finished.
The Outsider was critically acclaimed as a must-read for budding existentialists in the 50s. You literally went from obscurity to fame in no time at all, didn't you?
Again, it was equally astonishing what happened when the book was published. It came out in May 1956, and came out on the same day as a play called Look Back in Anger, by a playwright called John Osborne. And I literally woke up to find myself famous. The two major reviews in the sort of posh papers of that time raved about The Outsider. The phone began ringing, and it was Time magazine, Life magazine, the BBC, television, newspapers, and all the rest of it. It wasn't a pleasant sensation, actually, because if you become as famous as that suddenly, overnight, you feel rather as if you've been shoved in a washing machine and spun around.
Right.
So that, in a way, was irrelevant. And also, of course, you lose the intense subjectivity that you feel is the essence of your work, because suddenly you're out there among other people,
Right.
being continually harried and harassed.
Hard to be an outsider under those conditions,
Absolutely.
isn't it?
Fortunately, this didn't last too long, because the enormous amount of publicity received by myself and Osborne, they called us Angry Young Men. Then, of course, here in America, Jack Kerouac published his first book, On the Road, and Ginsberg had produced Howl, and suddenly they thought they got a great new generation, and there was non-stop publicity about the angry young men and the Beat generation, so that by the time my second book came out 18 months later, the critics were sick of the bloody angry young men, and the result was that my second book, which was called Religion and the Rebel, was panned, absolutely slaughtered. Time magazine came out with a headline, Scrambled Egghead, saying that all of the people who'd said that The Outsider was a work of genius had now discovered that I was actually a fake and a fraud. But oddly enough, it was a relief to have my feet back on the ground again and no longer have this spotlight dazzling me.
Right. You can get back to the business of your work, right?
Get back to work.
And stop being famous.
And what I'd done was to move to Cornwall. My publisher had said, for God's sake, get out of London, he will never write another book. So we moved to Cornwall, and I just got on with my work, and I've continued working quietly down there ever since then.
And you've written over 100 books on metaphysics and the human psyche. Where do you get your ideas from?
For example, one night I was staying at a friend's house, a farmhouse, in a remote part of Dorset, and I picked up a volume off his shelf. He was an American. This volume was called The Outsider and Others by H.P. Lovecraft. I'd never heard of Lovecraft, but I was intrigued by the title, The Outsider, since I'd written a book of that title.
Sure.
I read it through, during the course of that night. It was on old yellowed paper that would have cracked if you'd bent the page. The next morning, as Joy and I were driving off to see another friend, I began talking to her about the peculiar mentality that produces these grisly, gruesome horror stories of Lovecraft. This first was a tale about an undertaker who chops off someone's feet to make them fit a coffin. And, of course, he gets his comeuppance, I think, when the corpse comes walking up the stairs with blood flowing down the stumps. Anyway.
What is your assessment of such a mentality?
Well, I could see that, in fact, what he was trying to do was to create exactly that kind of intensity that the Romantics had wanted in the 19th century, but because this was the 20th century, you have to hit harder.
Yes.
You can't do it in that dreamy, beautiful, vague way of the 19th century Romantics. In other words, it was Romanticism given a sort of double twist.
Right.
And I went on to talk to Joy as we drove along, and the result of that was a book, because before the journey was over, I'd worked out a complete book called The Strength to Dream, which was about this use of the imagination as a kind of propellant above the surface of the boringness of everyday life, what Heidegger once called the triviality of everydayness. Now, all of my work has been around that kind of thing. But in 1958, 2 years after The Outsider came out, I produced a book called The Age of Defeat, which is called in America The Stature of Man, because they wanted an upbeat title. And the basic idea of the book was simply that in the modern world it's very difficult to write a book with a real hero. The heroes are either idiots like James Bond and Superman, and then they win. But if you're a serious hero, you can't win. And nearly all the serious heroes of modern literature end by committing suicide or getting killed or, die because fate is so inclined. Don't forget this was the time when Samuel Beckett, who said that life is absolutely, totally meaningless, was given the Nobel Prize, which has always struck me as a symbol of the stupidity of the 20th century.
Sure.
Anyway, I at this time received a letter from a professor of psychology in America called Abraham Maslow. And Maslow said that he'd read The Age of Defeat and was much struck by this feeling of mine that, somehow we had to get back to heroes who could win.
Right.
And Maslow said that as a professor of psychology, he'd got sick of studying sick people because sick people talked about nothing but their sickness. And so instead, he'd ask among his friends, who's the healthiest person you know? And they'd put him onto the healthiest person they knew, and he finally got a group of about 60 really extremely healthy people. And he quickly discovered, when he talked to these very healthy people, someone that no one had ever discovered before, because no one had ever bothered to talk to healthy people, that all of them had with great frequency what Maslow called peak experiences. But I continue to be obsessed by this notion of the outsider, the person who's experienced states of ecstasy and intensity and feels that they are an illusion, or at least that you can't grasp them. That's the reason, you see, that I was so struck by this Monroe Institute.
Right.
And obviously what Bob Monroe had done was to pin all this down with the kind of precision that would have saved the lives of those people in the 19th century.
Yeah. Well, the peak experience is definitely something that we consider valuable here. Colin, I need to take a little break here. When we come back, I want to discuss this concept a little bit further, so hold that thought. The Gateway Radio program will return in just a moment.
Hi, this is Frank DeMarco, Chairman of Hampton Roads Publishing Company. Since 1989, Hampton Roads has been publishing titles on a variety of cutting-edge topics. Visionary fiction uplifts the spirit and promotes metaphysical understanding. Alternative medicine promotes gentler, more effective tools for wellness. And metaphysics gives insights into out-of-body experiences, past lives, prophecy, and Toltec shamanism. Hampton Roads gives you the books that you really want but won't find anywhere else. Visit our website, www.hrpub.com, that's www.hrpub.com, or call 1-800-766-8009 for a free catalog. 1-800-766-8009. Hampton Roads Publishing Company, books for the evolving human spirit.
The sound of pure enjoyment. melodies which stretch the imagination. Meta-music, as richly diverse as your moods. Creating a sense of well-being. For home or office, meta-music provides the perfect ambient background for a stress-free environment. Working in concert with the patented Hemi-Sync technology developed by the world-renowned Monroe Institute, meta-music is the perfect complement to your relaxation. For a sample of our many meta-music titles, access our website at monroeinstitute.org or call 1-800-541-2488.
My guest today is Colin Wilson. He's an esteemed author who has written many, many books, widely read, on a variety of topics dealing in an extraordinary phenomenon. Colin, before we went to the break, you were discussing Abraham Maslow, Ph.D., and his work on the peak experience. What do you mean, for those who don't know, by the phrase peak experience?
Just these experiences of sheer bubbling, overwhelming happiness. Mm-hmm. For example, one of his students was working his way through college as a jazz drummer, mm-hmm. and at about 3 o'clock one morning, he suddenly found he was drumming so perfectly that he could not do a thing wrong, and he went off into another state,
sure.
The peak experience. Mm-hmm. And he went on to talk of these. One that interested me most was of a young mother who was watching her husband and kids eating breakfast, when suddenly a beam of sunshine came in through the window, and she suddenly thought, "My God, aren't I lucky?" and went into the peak experience.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is she was lucky before the beam of sunlight came in through the window, mm-hmm. but the beam of sunlight suddenly made her pull back, as it were, mm-hmm. and see the thing from a bird's eye view,
yes.
as if from above. Normally, we're stuck in a worm's eye view as we live, mm-hmm. living from minute to minute. And it's those curious bird's eye views that the writers of the 19th century, the great outsiders, wanted so badly. Wagner talked about art which lifts us above life and makes us spectators of it.
Yes.
This is obviously what we want. We want to get out of the worm's eye view mm-hmm. and into a bird's eye view. And in the 19th century, this was a deep and powerful instinct, but they didn't understand the instinct. They thought that it was an instinct to escape life itself, not realizing that what they really wanted was more life,
right.
not less.
Right.
So Maslow was, as far as I was concerned, a great breakthrough with this idea of the peak experience. What he really did was to make me see that I had been aiming towards the notion of being able to get into a state of great health, because Maslow had noticed that all peakers were extremely healthy, cheerful people. They weren't necessarily intellectual. I mean, one hostess who'd just given a highly successful party, mm-hmm. looking around at the room afterwards with, drinks spilled on the furniture and all this kind of cigarette ash on the carpet, thought, "My God, that was a good party," and went into the peak experience.
Right.
And yet, but she was basically healthy and positive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I could see that that was the trouble with these 19th century outsiders. They were not healthy and positive because they thought they were losers. And what Maslow taught me was that, in a sense, you are not a loser because you have this desire for an intenser type of consciousness. On the contrary, you are a potential winner, far more of a winner than the average person can be. And suddenly, I began to see what this is all about. In 1956, I'd been giving a lecture to the Shaw Society when I had found myself saying, the human race is on the point of an evolutionary leap to a higher stage. And I thought, afterwards, did I mean that, or did I just say it for effect? But the more I thought about it, the more I saw that I really meant it. Mm-hmm. And with Maslow, I began to see what this is really all about. The human race is, in fact, moving towards a different stage of evolution, and that recognition that there are, as Maslow put it, higher ceilings of human nature. He said that Freud had sold human nature short, and that we should be able to rise up to a higher level as a matter of perfect normality, ordinariness, not like the 19th century poets feeling that it's something rather weird,
right.
but as a matter of perfect normality.
And it's the thought by Western society that mystical or peak experiences are not normal, and they lead to depression in those who have actually had the experience.
Yep, absolutely. In other words, that, as you say, depression is unnecessary. Mm-hmm. It ought to be a completely unnecessary part of the human psyche. Now, what has struck me for a long time Well, simply that we are, in a sense, the luckiest people in history. We've generated this sort of marvellous technological society, and although people wince when you say that, in point of fact, it's wonderful.
Absolutely.
All the kind of thing that a girl in my class at Hollins College once said, when I was talking about how wonderful the modern world is, she said, "How can you be happy in a world with plastic kitchen tiles?"
As if true happiness is found in natural materials only, right?
And that kind of point of view strikes me as totally absurd. It does seem to me that we have more meaning than more reason for happiness than anybody at any point in history. The only problem is we don't know it. We're so close up, stuck with our nose against the canvas, so to speak, so stuck in a worm's eye view, that we find it very difficult to take that relaxed overall attitude. What we have to discover, what we have to recognize, is just how lucky we are. And that's the real problem, because what you've got to do is to produce an enormous paradigm shift in our culture. We've got to look at things from a completely different point of view. And this, of course, is what Bob Monroe was doing. That's why he strikes me as one of the most significant people of the 20th century.
Well, yes, he had given people the means to explore consciousness and thus have peak experiences in very safe, scientific ways, which do appeal to Westerners. It seems also to me that as we move closer to the millennium change, that more and more people are indeed having life-altering experiences and potentially altering their outlook on life or shifting their paradigm, so to speak.
Yeah, in fact, what you've just said does cheer me greatly. I keep coming across, don't forget, I live alone in Cornwall. I'm not surrounded by people who are interested in this kind of work. So
I see.
It's only when I come here to America, or, mix with people in London who are doing the same kind of thing, that I suddenly get the overall view and see what's happening. And what is happening, this seems to be true, is that we're beginning to take it more and more for granted that we are supposed to live in peak experiences. We're supposed to have them with great frequency. Later, actually, if I may, I'd like to say something about that paradigm shift, because I believe that is connected with abduction and with UFOs. But if you don't mind, just for a second, I'd rather not get into that.
We can take
because that's a sort of fairly recent insight, and it seems to me, again, a fairly important one. But for the time being, what had happened was simply that I came to recognize that Maslow indicated that, in fact, some enormous paradigm shift is gradually taking place, and that it's a good one. It's something we ought to be cheerful about. And that with Freud selling human nature short, and with the whole first part of the century dominated by the influence of people like Freud, and also, of course, in literature, by the influence of people like T.S. Eliot, of whom I greatly approve in many ways, but, who wrote The Waste Land, and, with lines in it like, what shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? That feeling that life is just boring repetition and no more. And that when you look deeply enough into life, what you see is futility and meaninglessness. Now, when I started writing The Outsider, the most fashionable philosophy of that time was called existentialism, and had come from Paris right after the war.
Starting with Sartre.
That's right. And its main exponents were Heidegger, the German philosopher, Sartre, and Camus. Camus was, in fact, my publisher.
Really?
He worked for Gallimard's, and they published The Outsider. And their basic feeling was that life is basically meaningless when you really look at it closely. Sartre had written a novel just before the war called Nausea, in which he claimed that state in which you look around you and suddenly say, what the hell am I doing here? What does it all mean? And feel that the feeling that most people have that life is meaningful is in fact an illusion which we impose upon life in order to be able to live. And Camus had written a novel called L'Étranger, which in English is translated as The Outsider, although in American it's The Stranger. And this was basically about somebody who feels a sort of indifference to life. He begins the novel by saying casually, Mother died yesterday, I went to her funeral, and so on. Then he says, I went to bed with so-and-so, and she said, do you love me? And I said, no, of course I don't. He's absolutely, totally honest. And feels that if you're totally honest, then what you see is that the world is meaningless.
But also very unemotional at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely, totally. And at the end of the novel, Camus' hero accidentally has committed a crime in court. Because of his total lack of emotion, they feel that he's a cold-blooded killer and he's sentenced to death.
Mm-hmm.
And in the condemned cell, when a priest starts talking to him about the future life and about repenting, he suddenly loses his temper, grabs the little bastard by the throat and gives him a terrific shaking. And when he's finished, he says, afterwards in the cell, he feels an immense happiness and relaxation, and looking at the stars, suddenly feels that he is a part of this enormous starry night, and for the first time says, I had been happy, and I was happy still. And yet the odd thing is, he didn't know he was happy.
Right.
And that's what struck me as so interesting. Maslow, once again. And how can you be happy and not know you're happy? And yet you know that that often happens, that you many a time begin talking about some time in the past and you say, my God, wasn't that a happy time? And then you realize that at the time you didn't think so at all.
Absolutely, sure.
And so, once again, it struck me that if you can get that point of view change and look from a different point of view, you suddenly recognize what Maslow had recognized, your own immense happiness in the present moment. Now, I had always been obsessed by Dostoevsky and by the fact that he'd been put in front of a firing squad and he'd been arrested as a rebel against the Tsarist regime.
Okay.
And he said that as he stood in front of the firing squad, he knew that he got approximately 3 minutes to live. And he decided that he would use 1 minute thinking about his own past, 1 minute thinking about the present moment, and 1 minute thinking about the future. And that these were the most intense minutes of his life.
Lived
Now,
well.
Well, you would see things from a bird's eye view in those circumstances. You'd be taken completely above the worm's eye view.
Absolutely.
Now, but there's a significance there, because you can see that in being taken out of the worm's eye view, what you've actually done is, because of crisis, achieve a tremendous lift from the Earth like a space rocket. Now, I was also fascinated by the author Graham Greene, who had, during his teens, sunk into a condition of total depression, so he said that everything looked flat and grey. He said that he would look at a scene that he could see visually was beautiful, but that meant nothing whatever to him. That dull, flat state. Then he found in a cupboard a revolver belonging to his elder brother and took it out onto Berkhamsted Common and played Russian roulette. Put one bullet into the chambers, spun the chambers, pointed it at his head and pulled the trigger. And when there was just a click, he felt, he said, an immense feeling of overwhelming happiness. He looked down the barrel and saw the bullet had now come into position, and he missed death by just one. And he said it was as if a light had been turned on, and I suddenly saw that all life is infinitely fascinating. But of course, being Graham Greene, he quickly sank back into his normal state of boredom and irritation, because it's very difficult. Once that is your paradigm, that life is basically boring, it's very difficult to see what you meant when you suddenly said it's absolutely marvellous. Now, you can see that that's the same problem the Romantics had. They were stuck in the 19th century paradigm, and suddenly, getting this glimpse, you don't understand the glimpse. You can't relate it to anything you know. Now, this had been my basic obsession, Dostoevsky. And Dostoevsky had also, by the way, he was reprieved at the last minute.
Oh, fortunate for him.
But the important thing, think what it must have been like to go back to your cell after being reprieved. Every single brick in the cell must have seemed to him infinitely interesting. You could spend a whole lifetime just looking at one brick.
Sure.
And this seemed to me to be the most important realization of all. Dostoevsky makes Raskolnikov, in his novel Crime and Punishment, say, when Raskolnikov thinks he's likely to be arrested and executed for the murder of this old pawnbrokeress, he says, if I had to live on a narrow ledge for ever and ever in eternal darkness and eternal tempest, I would still prefer to do that rather than die at once. Now, if you think of it, if somebody put a gun against your head and said, which is it going to be? Narrow ledge forever and ever, or shall I pull the trigger? You'd say, narrow ledge! What's more, when you think about that, you can see that the narrow ledge would be infinitely preferable to dying at once. The narrow ledge would contain endless possibilities, mental possibilities.
You can also experience the adrenaline rush of dying 1,000 times.
We know, though, that that would not happen, that we'd quickly begin to be bored on the narrow ledge and would probably jump off. And yet we can see that in that moment, we know the answer, and that the narrow ledge would be enough. In other words, it's once again this paradigm shift. If you can get out of there into that state of intensity and then, look around yourself and find where you are, instead of just getting a bewildering flash of something and then being back in your ordinary state, if you had time to stay there and look around, you'd really be somewhere.
Right. In my own peak experiences, I found that there are two common threads. First is that I'm completely present, as you were saying, and the other is that I have a real sense of unity with all things, if I can define it that way. Have you found that to be the case also?
What you're saying about being completely present, yes. I think you are truly present in the present moment. What human beings suffer from is mostly what a friend of mine calls elsewhereness. But although you're there apparently in the present, a part of you is elsewhere.
Sure.
And it's only when suddenly that part of you comes and sits in the present with you that you experience something real. Oneness with all beings, no, I don't tend to experience it. You know, frankly, I'm a bit too much of an intellectual. I get too stuck in my mental states. What I do find is that by sheer concentration and attention, I can lift myself out of these mental states in the way that you can lift yourself off the seat of a chair by grabbing it and pushing yourself up.
Right.
But it's quite difficult to do that kind of mental push-up. But it tends to be my own way of doing it. But it seems to me that there is a perfectly simple and straightforward technique there. The Zen master Ikkyu was once asked to write on a tablet something significant by a workman, and he wrote attention. And the workman said, oh, come on, you know, something interesting. So he wrote, attention, attention. And the workman said, what does attention mean? And he said, attention means attention. Now, although that seems very difficult to understand, you know, what do you mean by attention? And I once tried on my walks in the afternoon paying attention, and it didn't really work. And then suddenly it struck me what I was doing wrong. If you were sent back to Mozart's Vienna by some genie who said, look, I'm going to take you back to the Vienna of 1792 for half an hour only, and then you were back in the present, during the whole of that time your attention would be as intense as Dostoevsky's when he was in front of the firing squad. That's what attention means.
Absolutely.
It's Dostoevsky's kind of attention, and it does work. If, in fact, you pay total attention and hold your attention, not with meditation or anything, just hold attention for 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour a day, you suddenly discover that your whole consciousness is energized like soda water, fizzing away.
Absolutely. But to do it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you'd burn out in a week.
Yes.
Colin, I need to go to break here. When we return, I would like to discuss some of your latest works regarding the UFO phenomenon. We'll be back in just a moment.
The science of the mind, consciousness. Throughout human history, mankind has asked the basic questions of our existence. Who are we and where are we going? The Monroe Institute offers a unique series of programs designed to help you explore your fullest potential and unlock the secrets of conscious awareness. Utilizing its patented Hemi-Sync technology, these week-long programs present you the opportunity to explore your own inner world and beyond. For information on the Monroe Institute, its products and services, access our website, monroeinstitute.org, or call 1-800-541-2488.
Fascinating.
Compelling.
Profound.
Engrossing.
Stimulating.
Intense.
Inspiring.
Visionary.
Beyond the cutting edge.
Hampton Roads Publishing Company.
Books for the evolving human spirit.
Visit us at our website, www.hrpub.com, or call 1-800-766-8009 for a free catalog. www.hrpub.com, 1-800-766-8009.
Hampton Roads Publishing Company.
Colin Wilson is visiting us today. He's an author and researcher of strange phenomenon. His two most recent works, the latest of which is called Books of My Life. It's available through Hampton Roads Publishing. The last one is entitled Alien Dawn. It deals with the UFO phenomenon. Colin, how did you make a literary leap from the human psyche and peak experiences to UFOs?
The publisher of my book, which was horribly entitled From Atlantis to the Sphinx, said to me, how about writing a book on the question of life elsewhere in the universe? And I was quite prepared to write this book, scientific examination of the possibility of life in the stars and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But at this time, I went to a conference in Washington, and I talked to a man called David Jacobs, who was giving a talk about alien abduction.
Mm-hmm.
And what he said struck me as absolutely so impossible that, and besides, I couldn't really understand what he was talking about. Right. I didn't know anything about this.
Mm-hmm.
Then I bumped into another friend of mine called John Mack, who is a professor of psychology at Harvard. John had apparently got interested in this question of alien abduction. He'd met a man called Bud Hopkins in New York, and Bud Hopkins had told him about these people who think they've been abducted from their beds in the middle of the night, taken to some alien environment, which appears to be some kind of spacecraft, and that in this environment they're often physically examined by tall grey creatures who seem to be intelligent and kindly on the whole, although they don't really seem to care about us very much, and then they find themselves back in their own beds. And John had said, well, you must be mad, and so must they. But Bud Hopkins introduced him to a great many of these people who'd been through this experience, and they said, no, this kind of thing did definitely happen to us. And as he listened to them, John realized that these people were not psychiatrically disturbed in any way. They were just ordinary, perfectly ordinary, and very sincere people.
Who had extraordinary experiences.
Yeah. And neither was this through watching the X-Files or something on television.
Right.
People were telling him that they'd had their first experience at the age of 6, let's say 1936. Now, I only had to study this thing for a short time to realize, my God, this is true. Something is going on. A roper poll taken of Americans in the early 1990s, a sample of about 10,000 or something, discovered that 2% of Americans thought they'd been abducted. And if you extrapolate that to the general population, it's millions.
Sure. Something's
going on. Then I came across an observation by an old friend of mine called John Keel, who's been in this field since the 1950s. Like most people, I knew about UFOs because I was 16 when the first UFOs were spotted near Mount Rainier in Washington State by Kenneth Arnold. But, I just never thought it was important.
Right.
In fact, a friend of mine in New York said the other night, the nice thing about all this UFO stuff is, if like myself you're not very interested, you don't have to pay any attention. They'll never impinge on you. And I smiled and said nothing. But, nevertheless, John Keel had observed something that nobody else had noticed. That is that when UFOs appear, they go down through the colours of the spectrum, and that when they disappear, they go up the opposite way through the colours of the spectrum before they vanish. And what John deduced from this was that, in fact, these things appear to solidify, that, in other words, their vibrational rate is lowered until they're in our physical vibration rate, and that they can take off into another vibration rate. Now, it so happened that back in the days when I was studying the paranormal, I'd come across an interesting Cambridge Don, a professor called T.C. Lethbridge, Tom Lethbridge. Lethbridge, for reasons I can't go into at the moment, came to the conclusion that there are a number of different vibrational rates, and that we human beings are a fairly low vibrational rate, and that in fact we might even be living among people who are living at such a higher vibrational rate that we can't see them, in the same way that you can't read the name in a station when the train flashes through it at a great speed.
When you say we're living at a low vibrational rate, you're talking about our physical bodies, of course.
I'm talking about the physical universe around us.
Yes.
Yeah. And this notion that there could be several universes had already, in fact, been put by a number of people who started to study UFOs. M. Marshall Dowding, who was one of the earliest, he'd been a spiritualist and then got interested in UFOs, and he'd said as way back as 1952 that he thought UFOs in fact come from a parallel dimension. And this had been said many times. Now, it seemed to me fairly clear that all of the evidence shows that UFOs are coming from what you might call a parallel dimension or another vibration rate. So, in a certain sense, all of this stuff about the crash at Roswell and the rest became irrelevant. Maybe there was a crash at Roswell. Maybe the government did cover it up. I just don't know. But what is perfectly clear is we are not dealing with beings from Mars or the stars. We are dealing with beings who are, in a certain sense, here and now, who can manifest themselves, who are much more intelligent than we are, or some of them are anyway.
So you don't buy into the paranoid theories that these beings are coming from other planets to make us all slaves?
I do not, in any sense at all. Now, David Jacobs, when I'd seen him at this conference in Washington 3 years ago, where I should be going again next weekend, David had said, I think I've got the basic answer to what's going on. And I looked eagerly for his book, which he told me would contain the answer, and it's a book called The Threat. And he says human beings are in very bad trouble because he thinks that these things are taking us over.
Right, complete with little chips that go inside our minds. And yeah, it's a horrible scenario.
But on the other hand, while I can see exactly why he thinks so, my own study of this thing has convinced me that he's being far, far too pessimistic and that he's missing the point.
I find that to be the case with most people involved in the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, I was very intrigued by the experience of a woman who'd been driving up to Oxford with a friend. She wrote to Jacques Vallée, who's another old friend and who's in this UFO field, saying that they'd suddenly seen a UFO and they stopped the car to look at this thing, and she said it seemed to be cavorting around in the sky, almost as if trying to show off its capabilities, and that several other people had stopped their cars to stare at it for about half an hour, and it had finally disappeared behind some trees. And she said that as she drove on, it was as if some kind of knowledge were flooding into her mind from outside. That ideas were fizzing into her mind at such a rate that she said, I can't tell you what happened. All I can tell you is that I started out that afternoon as an agnostic, and I ended it as a kind of gnostic.
Right.
And she said, you know, all the religions have said what I saw in the course of that afternoon, and about God and meaning and the universe and all the rest of it. Now,
quite a peak experience, in other words.
Yes, quite a peak experience. And she went on, though, there's rather an interesting postscript, which is why she wrote to Jacques about it. She wasn't all that interested in this meaning content, or at least Jacques wasn't. What she said was that she'd gone to Stratford-on-Avon that evening to have dinner with friends, that she had walked over to the French windows, looked through the French windows, and suddenly, to her horror, seen on the lawn, in the light from the windows, a creature like a goat standing on its hind legs. She said it had great green eyes, the body was covered with a kind of soft greyish-coloured fur.
Almost a pan-like creature.
Pan,
right.
Yeah. And she was so horrified that she quickly retreated back into the room, thinking, my God, I've drunk too much.
Right.
20 minutes or so later, she went back and peered out again, and it was still there. This time it had moved to the edge of the light, but it was the same thing. So she didn't go near the window again that evening. Now, I bet you what you like, that if she had called to the other people in the room, hey, come and look at this, they would have looked out of the window and said, look at what?
Right.
They would have seen nothing whatever. I think that what had happened is that whatever had flooded into her mind that afternoon had put her on a new perceptual level of a different vibration rate, and that such things as, you know, these creatures, and also, you know, I believe such things as fairies and so on really exist. They are nature spirits, and they really do exist. They are on a different vibration rate, and some people can actually see them.
Sure.
And I think what's more, there are many such parallel vibration rates, probably dozens of them.
Absolutely.
Now, it was experiences like this that really began to convince me that we're dealing with something completely different. And I think that we human beings have got stuck at a certain stage of our evolution simply because we've developed this left brain, this intellectual capacity, and what's more, this beautiful civilization which requires full, total concentration most of the time. Now, what has happened at this point in history is that we need to get out of this cul-de-sac that we're stuck in. And I think that if you were a higher being and were looking down on these human beings who possess all kinds of powers of which they're totally unaware, you would sort of feel these things really need some help.
Well, pursuant to what you just said, there are also some people in the world who think that the universe is a sort of feedback learning system of which we are all a part of. And that peak experiences of all sorts, whether they be OBEs or whatever have you, are all somehow induced so that we can make these leaps in consciousness.
Yep, I agree with you absolutely, totally. In fact, Jacques Vallée and various other people call this UFO consciousness, this other level of consciousness that you can achieve through these things. As to the bigger questions you asked me about, the universe being a giant learning system, I honestly don't know. I don't look that far. I remain, in spite of all this apparent nuttiness, a scientist. I'm interested in just as far as I can see and in testing and what I can see so far.
Yeah, mind you, I use that as a metaphor for an abstract that I really can't grasp, whether that be God consciousness, Christ consciousness, universal consciousness, oneness, whatever you want to call that.
Absolutely.
There seems to be some form of intelligence behind the human evolutionary growth, especially with regards to consciousness.
That's exactly and precisely what I feel, and exactly why I feel that David Jacobs is wrong. I cannot believe, on the whole, that, we're being dragged into some kind of black hole by these things. You see, what I've noticed again and again over the past 20, 30 years is that when I'm on the right track, I get peculiar synchronicities, almost as if something is saying, okay, keep going, you're on the right track. Once I got up to get a book off my shelf while I was writing The Occult about alchemy, and I wasn't sure which book it was, and I was tired, and I didn't want to get out of my chair, but I groaned and got up, pulled the wrong book off the shelf, and the right book fell off at my feet, open at the right page. And that kind of thing has happened again and again.
Well-planned accidents, I call them.
Yep. Now, this time, while I was writing Alien Dawn, I've got a digital clock by my bedside, and all the time I was writing Alien Dawn, I kept waking up in the middle of the night for a pee and seeing double or treble figures, 11, 11, 12, 12, 222, 333. On the day I was due to finish Alien Dawn, I'd been awake just before 4 o'clock. I was lying dozing. I turned over to look at the time, and as I did so, I thought, I bet you what you like, it'll be 4:44. Sure enough, it was 4:44. And then that day I finished the book and it stopped. It came to a dead end, as if trying to show me something or other.
We're back to that chicken and egg question. Did you create that synchronicity to give you some sort of verification that there was something larger than the egocentric you at foot, on some subconscious level, of course? Or was this created for you to promote this this awareness?
I get a feeling that it's created for me. What appears to be happening is that forces outside us are, to some extent, manipulating us quite benevolently and giving us a push in the right direction, but for some reason we are quite important to them. What we can do, our cooperation, is immensely important. We're not just children being manipulated. We play some important part in this process.
Very much so.
Which I don't fully understand.
Neither do I. Colin Wilson is my guest today. He's a fascinating contemporary author with a unique historical perspective on the paranormal. Stay with us as we go to break. We'll be right back.
Peace of mind. For some, an elusive goal in today's hectic environment. For some, a way of life. Hemi-Sync, a patented audio guidance technology developed by the Monroe Institute, has been facilitating peace of mind for thousands of people worldwide for over 30 years. This unique combination of carefully sequenced sound patterns promotes the optimum brainwave responses for relaxation. Hemi-Sync has been proven safe and effective in clinical applications where a relaxing environment is necessary. Isn't it time you have your own peace of mind? For more information about the many fine Hemi-Sync products, access our website at monroeinstitute.org or call 1-800-541-2488.
Stargate, a top-secret government project created to study remote viewing, the ability to describe unknown objects, people, places, and things through psychic ability. For over 20 years, psychic spy Joseph McMoneagle worked to develop and use his remote viewing skills for national security purposes. In his classic book Mind Trek, he describes how remote viewing developed and tells how it really works. Now, in the new revised edition, he includes an entire chapter on the previously top-secret Stargate program. This is Frank DeMarco, chairman of Hampton Roads Publishing Company. Buy Mind Trek from your local bookstore or directly from us at 1-800-766-8009 and ask for our free catalog. Visit our website, www.hrpub.com. Hampton Roads Publishing Company, books for the evolving human spirit.
I'm in the studio with author Colin Wilson. Colin, you've also written several books on the occult and spirituality. How did you get involved in all of that?
Around about 1969, an American publisher, Random House, had contacted me and said, would I be willing to write a book about the occult, which had become very fashionable at that time because of a book called The Morning of the Magicians by Louis Pauwels and Jacques Bergier, which came out in 1960 and had become a bestseller. And quite suddenly, after the first half of the century, which had been entirely preoccupied, with left-wingery and communism and this kind of thing, many people had called me a fascist because I wasn't particularly interested in left-wing politics. And then quite suddenly there happened what for some weird reason happens in the last 30 or 40 years of every century, and has happened for the past 6 centuries, that sudden shift of focus to the paranormal. And I got interested in this, but I must confess that when I started getting interested in the paranormal, I was inclined to think that the whole thing was nonsense. I wrote the book, frankly, because I needed the money. And to begin with, I thought almost certainly all these people sort of going to seances and getting in touch with the spirits of the dead and so on were just deceiving themselves, and that they'd do far better off to concentrate on what this life means. But when I was researching the book, my wife picked up a book by Sir Osbert Sitwell, who was one of the family of poets, and Sitwell had described how just before the First World War, he and a group of brother officers had gone along to a palmist. And the palmist had looked at their palms and got more and more worried. And Sitwell finally edged over to her and said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "There's nothing in their hands." And of course, they were all killed during the next few months in the First World War. Now, when I read that by a man who I knew to be a total skeptic, his father was a famous debunker of mediums, I knew that I was onto something. And of course, the more I looked into this whole business of the paranormal, the more I realized, that this is so, that out-of-the-body experiences, that telepathy, that second sight, and so on are all true. At this time, I was really disinclined to believe in life after death. I mean, that seemed to me irrelevant. And it also seemed to me, there's no real proof. You hope so, but But on the other hand, things like Sitwell's palmist, that was real. And what this all meant to me was quite obviously human beings possess powers of which they're totally unaware. And what gradually came to me was the certainty that animals possess these powers quite naturally. They're sort of wide open to the universe, and they probably live in a deeply relaxed state, which is a little like being drunk. I've felt, this is the reason cows appear to be so happy. They're drunk.
They also don't tend to be very much into futurizing, and they tend to be very much in the present moment. Whatever it is they're doing that,
Absolutely. And of course, Walt Whitman said, we envy the cows and so on with their happiness and relaxation. But on the other hand, this is because they don't have our capacity to move out of the present moment. And the question from the beginning was, with these capacities of ours, these human capacities, is it in fact possible to be happy, or have we automatically condemned ourselves to unhappiness by ceasing to be cows? Now, at the same time, I came across a book called The Man-Eaters of Kumaun by a man called Jim Corbett, who was a tiger hunter. And he described how again and again his life had been saved in the jungle by what he called a jungle consciousness or jungle awareness, or jungle sensitivity, this sudden feeling that a tiger was lying there waiting to spring on him. And it struck me that he obviously possessed this ability because he needed it as a tiger hunter. The rest of us don't need it, and so we've tended to get rid of our so-called psychic powers, our powers of intuition and so on, and that modern man has gradually become so focused upon the problems of just staying alive in our complex modern society that he's got rid of powers that he actually possessed once and still does possess, although he's put them into cold storage. So it seemed to me that the question was simply, how do you get them out of cold storage? And
I have an even more interesting question. Why do we want to try and pull them out of cold storage at the end of every century? Harry Houdini made that same observation.
Yes, yeah.
And it seems at the end of every century, we tend to get a little bonkers.
Yes,
or a little more interested in our own spirituality. Well, as we move into this new millennium, there seems to be an awful lot of interest, at least here in the States, in
all over the world.
Yes,
Yeah.
in consciousness. And why do you think that is?
It does seem a rather weird historical accident, doesn't it? That it's occurred at the end of every century, since Paracelsus,
Yes.
and that it's gone on right down through Madame Blavatsky and all the rest of it. Even Isaac Newton was much more interested in the paranormal and the alchemy and so on than he was in science.
Absolutely.
So I get a feeling, that frankly, we are a part of some much bigger scheme, and there's something behind all this. There's something going on. There's some force behind all this. I think that these things appear to go in huge cycles, and that I think I begin to feel intuitively what these cycles are about. But you see, this introduction into the paranormal that made me aware that human beings apparently possess unusual powers also made me aware of something else that is partly an answer to the question you've just asked. Arnold Toynbee, the man who wrote A Study of History, described how he'd had the experience that made him want to write this. He'd been sitting up in the citadel of Mistra on Mount Taygetus in Greece in a completely relaxed state, and he said that as he sat there in this citadel, in which barbarian hordes had forced their way more than a century before and massacred everybody in the city, he was looking at the gap in the wall where these barbarian hordes had poured through, and suddenly it was real. It was as if he could actually see them coming through that gap in the wall, and this was because he was so deeply relaxed. And it was this experience that made him want to write The Study of History. Now, he said that he'd had 10 more similar experiences, in one of which he had experienced the whole of history, not just one particular incident, but it had become totally 100% real to him. Now, I call that Faculty X. And Faculty X is that odd ability to get into another mode of consciousness in which something which you know to be real but don't believe to be real suddenly becomes totally real to you.
Right.
And then I suddenly saw why we want to recover this paranormal ability. The paranormal ability in itself is totally unimportant. What is extremely important is to recover enough of the paranormal ability to focus it into Faculty X. Because think of it, Toynbee was able to do this not because he possessed paranormal ability and the ability to relax and all the rest of it. It was because he was a historian and he knew exactly what had happened there in Mistra in 1810. He knew exactly what had happened at Pharsalus in Greece when he had a similar kind of vision. He even knew the disposition of the armies in the battle and so on when he suddenly had a similar kind of vision. And so it depends upon knowing, in other words, what modern man has developed. An intellectual faculty for grasping things on a large intellectual scale. Combine that intellectual faculty with the paranormal abilities, and suddenly the two come together into Faculty X. And that's what we're moving towards, Faculty X.
Yeah, I agree with you totally, and I think we're in for quite a ride.
Yeah.
Colin Wilson, researcher, author, I want to thank you very much for a wonderful interview. I truly enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
Pleasure was mine. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. Be sure that you join us next time when Skip Atwater will give us a slightly different slant on the UFO phenomenon. Until that time, may peace be yours as you move into Faculty X. Good night, all.
Be certain to tune in next week to the Gateway Radio program and become informed on the latest information on the fascinating field of consciousness exploration and its practical application. The opinions and the views of the guests are presented to inform you on various phenomena in our world and are not necessarily in accordance with the views of the producers or the Monroe Institute. For more information on the Gateway Radio program, write to Gateway Radio, care of the Monroe Institute, 62 Roberts Mountain Road, Faber, Virginia, 22938. This edition of the Gateway Radio program is the exclusive property of the Monroe Institute. Copyright 1997 and is broadcast by permission. Any unauthorized broadcast or duplication of this program is prohibited by law. Thank you for listening.